Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Migrating to XenMobile Service and Citrix Cloud. My name is Sarah Queen, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for our services portfolio here at Citrix. In today's session, our Citrix consulting team will discuss your options for transitioning to XenMobile Service and critical lessons learned from our early adopters. We'll then close with our consulting services offerings that are available to support your transition should you need it. Before we get into the presentation, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. We will have a live Q&A session toward the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording this event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. And finally, the slides are available for download from the Event Resources tab located along the top of the interface. Okay, now I'll hand it over to Steve Beals, Services Relationship Manager on our Americas Professional Services team. Steve?
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Stephen Beals, and I'm a Service Relationship Manager with our Americas Consulting team. I am currently based out of New York, and I cover our West Central region for our enterprise customers. I'm joined today by Ryan McClure, who is a Senior Architect in our Americas Consulting organization, and he is based out of our Chicago office. Ryan has been involved with some of our largest XenMobile and cloud deployments that we have seen within our consulting organization. He has been a speaker at Synergy, Summit, and ServTech in both Americas and Asia, and has authored several Citrix blog posts for our community. Today, we will be discussing our XenMobile service migration, and our agenda for today is as follows. Ryan will be taking us through our XenMobile service overview, what is coming in our XenMobile service, and what are the implications, common objections to the XenMobile cloud service, our transition options, which are benefits and or drawbacks, our migration highlights, any of our prerequisites and lessons learned from our current XenMobile service migrations, and then I will be discussing how Citrix can help. After which we will have a Q&A session where we will be able to answer your questions that you may have. With that, I'd like to move this conversation to Ryan, who will begin by taking us through the XenMobile service overview.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve. I figured it would make sense to start out today with a quick overview of the XenMobile service because it's changed a little bit since some customers may have seen it in the past, and some folks on the webinar might not be familiar with the architecture. So the way that the XenMobile service works looks like this. Essentially, you've got the XenMobile server and database components that are hosted in a Citrix-operated cloud service. The MDM, or mobile device management load balancing role, also resides in that service. And then you've got the NetScaler gateway portion, which really hosts all of the user-facing traffic that still lives in the customer's data center. We also have this little component called the Cloud Connector, which is really kind of the brains behind the operation and facilitates communication with a number of the on-prem services that our XenMobile service depends on. So things like Active Directory, PKI infrastructure, your XenApp and XenDesktop deployment, if you're aggregating those resources in. And the way that the traffic flow ends up operating is that this Cloud Connector forms a 443 outbound connection up to Citrix Cloud and brokers all of those communications. So, for example, the security and firewall rules are pretty straightforward. And then all of the control traffic, so some of that initial authentication, the mobile device load balancing traffic, that's going through the NetScaler load balancing instance that is hosted up in our XenMobile service. But that user traffic, the data traffic that really impacts user experience, so things like mail sync, web browsing, HDX application launch, and the subsequent ICA traffic, those are still going through the NetScaler gateway that live in the customer's data center. So we're not adding unnecessary latency or round trip time to those user experience critical workflows. So the XenMobile service is located in the US and EMEA today, and you can see some APJ locations that we are aware of and working towards. We back up data daily for 3 months. Our service level objective is 99.9%, and it's a 24/7, 365 service. So really some of the main benefits to the XenMobile service architecture are that all of the XenMobile server and NetScaler patches for the NetScalers that live up in that XenMobile service portion of the offering, those are all managed and executed by our XenMobile Cloud operations team. So you don't need to worry about the maintenance and patching of those components. You still have full autonomy over the configuration of the XenMobile servers themselves through the XenMobile console, but you no longer need to worry about database maintenance and backups. You no longer need to worry about XenMobile server patching, all that good stuff. You still do operate and patch the NetScaler gateway that lives on-prem in your data center. And the other nice thing about the offering is that cloud connector piece that lives in your data center is patched from the cloud service down. So while you would maintain and operate the Windows operating system that cloud connector lives on, the cloud connector Citrix specific software is actually patched from the cloud down. So you don't even have to worry about that piece. Another key benefit is that the XenMobile service is a highly regimented architecture. So every customer architecturally is running essentially an identical deployment to another customer, making it highly predictable and dependable because we know exactly what scenarios to test for internally. So there have been some discussions out there around what's coming for XenMobile and specifically what's coming for the XenMobile service. And we made an announcement recently that's going to be really exciting for especially our existing on-prem customers that are looking to move towards the XenMobile Cloud service. So up until this point in time, if you have an existing on-prem deployment and you wanted to switch over to the XenMobile Cloud service, that required a re-enrollment. We have quite a few customers that are in that boat because either they don't want to patch and maintain the XenMobile servers anymore, they've got an overall sort of cloud initiative that they're driving towards, and XenMobile makes sense to be a part of that, or a host of other reasons. But the main challenge those customers always have is when they take those IT benefits back to the business and say, this is something we want to do, the conversation really stalls as soon as we get to the point of, well, in order to do that, we need to re-enroll all of our users from the on-prem environment over to the XenMobile Cloud service. And up until this point in time, that's something that was required. But as of this quarter, we can actually make that transition from an on-prem deployment to the XenMobile Cloud service with no re-enrollment required. So for phase one, we're starting with MDM only customers. Phase two was MDM plus MAM, so those enterprise mode customers. We've got customers that have already gone through both of those phases and have been able to do this successfully. So as we move into phase three towards the end of Q1, that's really about opening the adoption to a bit wider customer base, but we've already got customers that have successfully done this, and this removes one of the major blockers or barricades for those customers that have an existing on-prem environment today and want to make that move. The other sort of consideration is that over the next couple of quarters, the XenMobile roadmap is going to start favoring the cloud service a little bit more than we've seen in the past. So what does that mean for me if I'm an existing customer or even if I'm talking about a brand new deployment today? Well, we've really been encouraging our customers in the field to consider the XenMobile service as option one. And it's for some of those reasons that I stated in the beginning, the increased dependability, predictability, stability, the simplified patching and administrative overhead. But in addition to that, some of those roadmap considerations that we just talked about a minute ago are also worth having in the back of your mind. Now, if you're one of those customers that needs to deploy on-prem now, you can remember that you can always migrate to the XenMobile service later if you decide that it's necessary. But for new deployments, we're really trying to get customers to consider the cloud service as kind of option number one. If you have an existing deployment, there's certainly nothing that says, hey, just because we came out with this new option to get to the service that you have to make that move today. But there's been no better time to start considering that move because now we can do it without a significant impact to our end users. So if you decide that that is going to be right for you for, whatever reason, whether it be that you have internal initiatives that aligns with, or you like the simplified maintenance model, Now's the time to determine, how you want to make the move. So do we want to build a net new environment in parallel and just deal with that user re-enrollment, which we can still do? Or do we want to go with this migration model where we essentially replicate the configuration and user data from your on-prem database up to the XenMobile service, and then we can make that cutover without user impact? And if we decide which path we want to take, then we can identify our timelines and then just validate that the environment we have on-prem meets some of the prerequisites for that offering. And we'll talk a little bit later about what those prerequisites are. So before we get into those prerequisites, I thought it'd be first be useful to cover some of the common objections that we hear when we start talking to customers about this. Because on paper, a move to cloud where I have less maintenance to do all sounds like a good thing, but there are some realities of the move that we need to be aware of, because they're common discussions that come up either with the IT teams that will be supporting these environments long-term, or from a business and process perspective. The first one that always seems to come up when we talk about a cloud service, whether it be XenMobile specifically or really any cloud service, is testing and change control. That notion of, I can't go cloud because I can't test my changes and I don't know when things are going to happen. So I've lost control of those maintenance cycles. Well, there's some things we do with the XenMobile cloud service to mitigate that. One, customers are notified by email prior to changes and upgrades, and those emails include the expected impact. Because of the way that upgrades work in the cloud compared to on-prem, that impact is typically lower for the cloud service than what a similar change would require on-prem. But again, we try and be very proactive about notifying you, especially if there's any user impact expected. The next thing is that customers of sufficient scale are eligible for a QA environment in that cloud service. So that QA environment can go through whatever maintenance is scheduled prior to your production instance, so you can validate that none of your environment-specific configurations are impacted by the change that goes in. We're also making the same sets of changes to groups of customers that are running a very regimented architecture. So it's less and less likely that something would impact your environment that wouldn't impact our test instances and other customers who are going through these same upgrades at the same time. So those sort of economies in scale and safety in numbers concepts really help customers realize typically improved stability in the cloud over what they may be running with the same configurations on-prem. Getting back to those configurations, customers are still 100% in control of how the XenMobile servers themselves are configured. So what applications are published, what policies are pushed, how timeouts are configured, those sorts of things. So we can replicate those configurations from your existing environment to production, either by doing it manually, or rather up to the cloud, either by doing it manually, or we can use this new migration option and do that programmatically. The next sort of common objection we get is just overall organizational cloud readiness. So the notion that I can't go cloud because we're not ready as an organization. We don't have policies and standards in place to go about creating a cloud service. We haven't identified what our security guidelines and standards are going to be. We've found that a number of customers, especially probably 18 months ago when we were really starting to drive customers towards the XenMobile service, we found that the XenMobile service is a really good starting place for customers that are in this situation, because it's fairly light in terms of company and user-specific data or information that needs to be stored in the cloud, and really the number of IT systems that have to be integrated. So we showed on that first diagram that the cloud connector is talking to 2, 3, maybe 4 systems internally, and it's a 443 outbound connection. So in terms of the overall security posture impact that this has to an organization and the need to really modify operational standards, there's not a whole lot that the XenMobile service require changes. It's not like we need to extend Active Directory up to the cloud or anything like that. those sorts of decisions often require a lot more planning and buy-in from various IT and business stakeholders, and the XenMobile service doesn't have a ton of requirements like that. So for that reason, the XenMobile service really ends up being a good first step for those customers who are early in their cloud process or maybe don't quite have those organizational standards in place yet. And the last one is around customization and control. So this one is a little bit more tricky than the first two. So there are customers that say, well, I can't go to the cloud service because I run a bunch of custom reports and I need direct database access for whatever reason. Now, oftentimes the direct database access requirement comes about because they're doing something on-prem that maybe is a little bit outside of the way that the product is typically used, and they end up needing custom database access that way. And sometimes the move to the cloud mitigates the need to do that in the first place. Other times the custom database access is for specific reporting or information that they need to provide to management. And that is a legitimate consideration today. We don't permit customers direct access to that cloud-hosted database to run custom reports against. That said, the burden of gathering telemetry around your environment largely shifts to the XenMobile Cloud Operations team. So some of those things that you may be reporting on today, you may decide now that you're consuming this as a cloud service, you don't really need to report on tomorrow. And we also have more frequent release cycles with the cloud than we do on-prem. So we have additional vehicles to adapt to customer feedback as we get more and more information about the types of reports and information that customers were otherwise having to gather in a custom fashion. So some other general considerations about the move to the cloud. So, another thing that I hear all the time is, well, if we go to the cloud, how do we do DR, or is DR taken care of automatically? So for the components of this solution that live in your data center, we can still produce a DR solution. So things like those connectors, the NetScaler gateway piece, your Active Directory infrastructure, et cetera, that live still in your data center. We do have ways to create data center failover for those from the cloud services perspective, so that if you were to have an outage in your primary data center for whatever reason, the XenMobile service that you are consuming from the cloud would still have the ability to communicate with those on-prem components in your secondary data center in the way that we need them to. The next thing that comes up is always performance concerns. Well, we're putting this stuff in the cloud, so how do I know it's not going to perform worse all of a sudden? So the traffic that's really related to user experience is still going through that NetScaler gateway on-prem. That's web browser traffic. When I launch HDX applications, if we're aggregating those from storefront, and secure email sync are really kind of the primary conventional data flows that impact user experience in the XenMobile world. And all of those are still going to flow exactly the way they do with the solution deployed on-prem. Things like policy update, if all of a sudden we decide, hey, we want to change our passcode or device passcode lock from 4 digits to 6 digits, a user's not going to know if that takes an extra 5, 6, 7 seconds to get to their device. And even that's not likely to be the case because the device is connecting to an internet service rather than your data center. At the end of the day, from an LTE network, that connection is likely going to be apples to apples. But even if that were the case, that's not really a traffic flow that users are concerned about from a UX perspective. And the last one that always comes up is, we do have customers out there that have different use cases. So they have a MAM-only use case maybe for BYO devices, and then they've got some devices that they operate in a kiosk-type mode. And because of the way that they have some of their procedures and standards detailed, they end up needing 2 separate environments, one that's in MAM-only mode and one that's in MDM-only mode, or one that's in MAM-only mode and one that's in enterprise mode. And this same approach can be taken with the XenMobile service. So a given customer can have a MAM-only instance and an enterprise mode instance if that becomes necessary based on some of the configurations that you need to implement. So now that we've covered some of the common considerations around moving to cloud or not moving to cloud, we get into the transition options. So The first thing I always find helpful when I'm having these discussions with customers is to level set terminology, because it does get a little confusing. Different vendors use these terms differently. Sometimes we even use these terms internal to Citrix to mean different things. So when we're talking migration, we're talking about the option where we take settings from your existing environment, we export them, and we import them into the XenMobile Cloud service. So there's no reconfiguration required and no user re-enrollment. So when I'm talking about a migration from on-prem to cloud, that's what I'm referring to. When I use transition or parallel build, we're talking about the settings are not being migrated, that user data is not being migrated. We're just doing a net new build with manual reconfiguration in the XenMobile Cloud service, which is an option we've had since day one of the cloud service being available, but is a viable option for some customers. So we'll get into some of the pros and cons of each of those options on our next couple of slides here. So we talk about the migration as option one. What are some of the main advantages to that? The biggest one really is that no re-enrollment of end users, which is a huge business outcome or impact. And again, like I mentioned before, that was one of the main places where these conversations stalled. I really like the concept of going to the XenMobile Cloud, but I can't re-enroll my users, so it's not an option for me. Well, now we can make the migration without re-enrollment, so that's obviously a huge advantage to that path. We also don't have to reconfigure much of anything from an administrative perspective, so we're saving time and effort there from the teams managing the environment as well. And the transition is effectively seamless for the end users. We've got ways that we can go about testing that things are working before we make the cutover. And when we do make the cutover, assuming everything goes as planned, users don't really even know that this happened. Now, some of the disadvantages, right? If you've got an environment today where you have existing issues or you think you have misconfigurations, well, if we take those issues and misconfigurations from your on-prem environment and we export that information and migrate it to the cloud environment, we're probably going to have those same issues and misconfigurations. So if one of the things you're looking to get out of this move is, let's start from a clean slate, the migration option's probably not the right one for you. The next consideration is that big bang cutover approach. Like I mentioned, we do have a cloud-hosted DNS service that allows us to test that the new environment is working the way that we want it to before we go and pull that trigger, which is a big risk mitigation step. So, the risk here is lessened significantly, but there's always a little bit more risk when we're talking about that big bang approach. All of a sudden, we're running all of our users off of the on-prem environment today. We flip that switch. If something does go wrong and now they're all pointed to the cloud environment, we've got a big portion of the user population impacted when you compare it to, all right, we're going to transition user group by user group from environment on-prem to environment in cloud over the course of 3 or 4 months. There are some testing requirements for a secondary NetScaler instance on-prem when we do want to go through that testing process that I talked about. There are some kind of tricky ways we can get around it being a totally separate instance potentially, but really to run a robust test that is going to be reflective of how things end up looking in prod, that second instance is really the way to go. And then the last kind of main consideration is that SSL listener cert for your XenMobile enrollment URL is something that has to reside in that cloud database that Citrix is now hosting, or we can't maintain that URL, and we wouldn't be able to do this without re-enrolling users. So, that it's more of a security consideration than it is a technical complexity or anything like that, but it is something to be aware of when having these discussions with other teams like your security department. So other considerations around this option, the migration should really be your leading option if the primary business priority is no impact to your end users. It's really the only way to deliver on that business priority. It requires significantly less user training and coordination. So the users are still using the same mobile applications on the client side. They don't have to be trained to unenroll the device and then go and re-enroll the device and re-download apps and reconfigure secure web and secure mail or anything like that. You would likely notify them that, hey, we're making a change just in case anything were to be noticeable on their end. But for the most part, this is seamless and transparent to your end users. Now, it is slightly higher risk, again, because of that big bang cutover approach that we talked about. But again, we've enabled some testing capabilities here that we didn't even, for example, have when we were doing some of those XenMobile 9 to 10 migrations around validating that things are working in the new environment prior to making that cutover, that really do help us mitigate some of that risk. And the last consideration here is that if you were planning on a change that requires re-enrollment anyway, for example, enabling certificate-based authentication rather than just username and password, the migration option doesn't make a whole lot of sense because those users were going to have to re-enroll anyway. So moving on to option 2, the transition option, the advantage here is that it's highly controllable in terms of our pace of transition. You can start off with your lowest risk or lowest business impact user group, let them transition their devices, make sure everything looks good, make sure that the environment is scaling the way that you expect it to, that resource utilization is where we expect it to be. We've got kind of total control of that pace of transition. We also have the ability to start from a clean slate if we feel like things have happened in the on-prem environment that exists today that we want to change, or we learned some lessons about how we approach things day one, and we want to approach them a different way now. We would also eliminate any old or stagnant device entries that have been sitting out there because users got rid of the device, or it's been sitting in a drawer and turned off for 3 or 4 months. So a little bit of inherent cleanup happens with this option. And we don't require that additional temporary infrastructure for testing purposes. Now, the disadvantages here, the huge one is obviously that this method does require both device re-enrollment by an end user, and it requires that we manually reconfigure anything we've got set up that we want to bring over. We also have to maintain both of those environments during the transition, because now we're not talking about a big bang cutover where, day 0 we're all on-prem and day 2 we're all in the cloud. We're talking about, potentially a several-month transition period where we're going to have users running on-prem for an extended period of time and users up in that cloud service now that will be running for a period of time in parallel. And having those multiple environments operating in parallel for those customers that are doing any sort of active sync filtering with XMM or XNC, it can complicate things there a little bit around, okay, which environment becomes quote unquote the master in terms of the state of the device and that sort of thing. So again, all things we can work through and work around. When we're talking about even something as significant as device re-enrollment, we can enable users and train them and provide them documentation. So these are all scenarios that we have ways to work through with customers, but certainly things to be aware of with this option. Now, when we talk about some of the considerations for the transition option, again, this should really be your go-to strategy if your number one priority is risk mitigation, or that's starting from a clean slate model. It does require a higher degree of user interaction and coordination. So if you're going to go with the transition model, you're going to have to start planning that aspect of things a whole lot earlier in the process. And this model facilitates changes that we're going to require re-enrollment anyway. So for example, if you're having a hard, your security team really wants to move to certificate-based authentication because of the advantages, but you're having a hard time selling to the business, hey, we need to re-enroll users just to get cert-based auth. Well, maybe this is another carrot that you can dangle that, hey, if we re-enroll users, not only can we get cert-based auth out of this, but we can also transition over to this XenMobile cloud service. And now we don't have to patch these machines ourselves, and we don't have this database that we have to operate, and some of the benefits that we talked about earlier, right? So it can be positioned as another business benefit or outcome of user re-enrollment if you've already got a reason that you're thinking you might need to do it anyway. So in terms of some of the prerequisites and lessons learned from the first couple of times that we've gone through this, I've got a couple of these in red because they were the ones that were a little bit less predictable as we went through, right? So the fact that we need a couple of cloud connectors, that's known. You see 2 or more there. And the reason for that is, like I mentioned before, those cloud connectors are patched. They pull updates from the cloud service down. So as one is being updated, you need to have another one up and operational, or you have a temporary service interruption for your environment. So you want at least 2 of those. The connectors in the cloud service are smart enough to know not to patch both of yours at the same time. And a number of customers consider designing N+2 there just because they like to make the assumption that, hey, one is always being patched, so I still have high availability even if that's the case. Now, obviously, they're not always being patched, so that's kind of an above and beyond redundancy step, but it is a step that some customers choose to take. XenMobile server needs to be up to date, so N-1 from a version perspective when we make the transition. We need to be using a SQL database, so no Postgres database for this migration offering. If that's something that you're running today, then you're kind of stuck with the transition option. These next 2 cropped up on us a little bit less expectedly, I guess, as we went through some of these initial attempts, is that the domain enforced functional level needs to be 2008 R2 or later, which certainly a number of customers are these days, but there are certainly customers that are not. So that is a requirement of the XenMobile service and the connector to integrate with AD properly. So just a quick check mark to validate before you go through this process and start validating these things internally on your own. We also have quite a few customers out there that use wildcards for that SSL listener cert. Technically speaking, there's nothing that prevents us from bringing that wildcard cert up and having it reside in that XenMobile service database, but it's certainly not the strongest security posture to take that approach. So in these scenarios, we've really recommended that customers go to a non-wildcard SSL listener cert for XenMobile before we make the move, and then we bring that non-wildcard cert up with us rather than the wildcard. There are some permissions we need on the SQL side to create a backpack file to transition up to the cloud service. They're pretty well documented by Microsoft as well as the process, so that one's usually fairly straightforward. The other one that's caught a couple of customers is those original XMS PKI passwords. So way back when you did the install of those XenMobile server nodes, you had to create a PKI password, and we need to know those for this transition to work properly. And the last one is a XenMobile server local admin account, which again, typically is not an overly complex prerequisite. So the 2 that I think customers are going to end up spending the most time on here are really those PKI passwords and making sure that they have record of what those were somewhere. And then if you're using a wildcard cert today, strongly considering a non-wildcard cert before you think about making this move. So some other sort of basic checklist items. We can't do FIPS today with the XenMobile service. So if end-to-end FIPS is a requirement, then XenMobile service is not an option at this point in time. We talked about those custom queries and reports against the database. If you're either using the MSP feature of XMM or using SMG, which is well past support at this date, those are not supported with the XenMobile service. There are a handful of customers out there that are using third-party PKIs or GPKI providers, which require some XML file customizations that are not supported with the migration option. We also don't support syslog integration today, although we do fully expose the XenMobile API, so there are a lot of things that you would typically do with syslog that potentially we can do that way instead. If you're using any non-standard ports, so anything aside from 8443 and 443, that's not supported for the migration option, and then XenMobile remote support. Essentially, if you can say, you can check the true box for each of these, you don't require FIPS, you don't require custom DB access, you're a candidate for the migration option if that's the path you decide is right for you. So some other general tips and tricks. We talked about this one already, actually, the separate NetScaler gateway instance for mobile application management traffic testing if you do the migration option. So again, this is, okay, we've decided we want to go down the migration path. We want to make sure that everything is up and operational before we pull the trigger. This instance would just be something you needed to have up and running during that testing phase before you flipped the switch or pulled the trigger to make sure everything was working. Once you go through the cutover and everything looks good, you could spin this instance down and get rid of it. It's certainly not a long-term requirement. Another thing that a lot of customers have done going through this process is if you have a QA or a test environment on-prem, we can migrate that to a corresponding QA environment in the XenMobile service. So not only can we test that the process is working, but we can first test that it works for your QA environment, then repeat the process for your prod environment, do the side testing for the prod environment as well, and then pull the trigger in the prod environment. So we've kind of doubled up our diligence that way. If you are an Apple DEP customer, so device enrollment program, the configuration has to be removed and re-added. This is actually an Apple requirement where they log the IP that the configuration was initially created from. It's not a user impacting change or anything, but we said that you could just take the configurations from on-prem, export them to the cloud, and you're done. Apple DEP is kind of one of the tiny little exceptions to that where you just have to remove the config and re-add it. Wildcard cert piece, again, we covered. This is less a technical limitation than it is really just a security posture limitation. So we're really, really strongly encouraging customers not to use wildcard certs for that SSL listener. And then the other piece is the cloud connectors. So those are supported with an unauthenticated proxy today, not an authenticated proxy. Now, because both the source, the cloud connectors themselves, and the destination, the Citrix Cloud Service, is known, most security organizations would consider an unauthenticated proxy kind of good enough there. But if you do require an authenticated proxy, this is a consideration to be aware of. And again, many customers design N+2 when we're talking about these cloud connectors, just in case they do have issues at any point in time with one getting patched, that they still are highly available while they may be troubleshooting whatever issue or that box is rebooting or what have you. So with that, that covers the majority of the considerations and tips and tricks we wanted to walk you through. So I'll hand it back to Steve, who's going to talk through a little bit on how Citrix can help with this.
Thanks, Ryan. A lot of great information there for our customers as they start to think about their move to the XenMobile Cloud Service. So with that, I wanted to just talk a little bit of how Citrix Professional Services can help you with this migration to the cloud service. Really what we want to make note of here is that we accomplish this by aligning our migration services with your needs. And really our end goal is to ensure that you have a successful move of your XenMobile deployment to the cloud service. Our services fall within 3 categories: basic, advanced, and premium. Each service will begin with a free 1-hour remote site assessment. This site assessment is utilized to determine which service path, basic, advanced, or premium, will best meet the needs of your organization as you migrate to the XenMobile Cloud Service. The basic migration service is included with each new service subscription to XenMobile Cloud. And it includes what you see here: the database export, the Azure database creation, cloud connectors, NetScaler configuration scripts, and cut over to the DNS via DNS. The advanced service is a paid fixed fee service that adds onto our basic service, and is for our customers whose environments may have a bit more advanced features enabled with them, which some are listed here. Both the basic and advanced service offerings have been developed in such a way that they should fit the needs of most of our customer base. However, if during the site assessment, our team working with you does determine that either of these services are not a fit, a premium service may be recommended to assist you with your migration to the Citrix Cloud. Our premium service offering features a full deep dive assessment and design guidance for moving your on-premises XenMobile environment to XenMobile Cloud, be it through the migration or transition option as Ryan discussed earlier. Our team will work with you to implement and test the solution and assist with all migration planning items and provide rollout support to your end users. Working with your service relationship manager and the completed site assessment, this services will be scoped, and the number of hours for this will vary depending on the size and complexity of your current XenMobile environment. With that, before we move into our Q&A, I do want to remind our audience that if you have a question for our speakers, you can submit it in the Ask a Question area on your screen. You can simply just type your question into the text box and then hit submit. And with that, we can move into our Q&A session.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, let's go ahead and hand it back over to Ryan for Q&A. It looks like we've already got several great questions that have already come in. Ryan?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So the first one is around using the XenMobile Cloud service in parallel with on-prem for disaster recovery purposes. So I'll go ahead and cover that one. The intent is not to use the two solutions in parallel for DR. The data migration has to be done more or less in real time to show accurate states of device enrollments, and it's not an iterative process. So you quickly become out of sync between on-prem and the cloud, so the solution's really not set up for that today. The next question is around GDPR and whether the XenMobile Cloud service has been implemented according to GDPR law. Justin, I'll go ahead and shoot that one over to you if you want.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. So yeah, in regards to GDPR, we are in the process of the XenMobile service, making sure that we follow all the GDPR compliance laws, and our timeline is to have all the implementations set for GDPR standards by the go live date of the European regulations. So thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Justin. While you're at it, there's also a question around Windows 10 supportability for device management in the latest versions. You want to comment on that real quick?
Yeah, definitely. So from XenMobile service perspective, we are heavily focused on Windows 10 and making the XenMobile service more of a unified endpoint management service to support full Windows 10, which we currently do right now in the latest version of Cloud, as well as other platforms in the near future, such as Chromebooks and Raspberry Pi. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Justin. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to meet Justin, Justin is one of our product managers on the XenMobile Cloud side, so he is really an authority around not only this migration service, but also how a lot of this stuff works and is implemented under the hood. Okay, moving on to the next question. Is there a minimum version requirement for the existing on-prem XenMobile that allows a migration to the cloud? So yeah, we're really looking to target N-1 versions on-prem. So if the latest release is version 10.7, as long as you're running 10.6 or later, you would be a candidate for the migration to the cloud. If you're not, you can always upgrade to that latest version, obviously, and then make the migration once you've upgraded. Okay, there are a few licensing questions here, so without going into detail, I would just say that we can expect to see some announcements around licensing transitions and models over the next few weeks. So those details probably aren't something that we want to dive into on this Q&A, but there should be announcements coming out in the next couple of weeks that clarify how that'll all look. Okay, the next question is, we have a customer with XenMobile Mail Manager installs. What happens to this service when we migrate to the cloud? So XenMobile Mail Manager can integrate with the XenMobile Cloud service just like it can with the on-prem solution. So basically you just point XenMobile Mail Manager to your cloud instance and it'll continue to operate as it has on-prem. So that works just fine. Okay. Next question around the move to certificate-based authentication. So the question is, am I correct in assuming that we could make the change to based off after migration, and then the user would gain that advantage as they re-enroll into Cloud XenMobile. So the way that this would look is we would do that sort of parallel build model where we would implement certificate-based authentication in a parallel build in a cloud service, and then when the user unenrolled from the on-prem service and re-enrolled into XenMobile Cloud, they would start to take advantage of cert-based auth. Okay, the next question is around rollback to on-prem. So if method one failed for whatever reason, what's the rollback process? So Justin, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ryan. So the rollback process is, and like mentioned, we do have a we do a test drive, and what actually this means is instead of doing an all or nothing DNS switch with you, the customer, you control the DNS switch on your end. We have a cloud-hosted DNS server that we're able to point a set of devices, iOS, Android, Windows devices that you have enrolled, and point to the actual cloud public IPs to ensure that devices are connecting in, new devices can enroll, check-ins and policy pushes are still happening. But always, again, we do it more of a canary rollout to ensure the migration was successful. If, in fact, you make the switch over and everything, for some reason, something doesn't happen, devices start to unenroll for one reason or another, you can always just go switch the DNS back to point to your on-premise load balancer, and then devices will connect back in just as they were before. So, and that's kind of the idea behind this migration. They're both using the same URL. Ultimately, everything's controlled by the DNS itself that you, the customer, control. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Justin. The other half of that question is, if I change from a wildcard cert to a host-specific cert, does that require re-enrollment? So as long as it's done properly and we don't have certificate pinning to deal with, no, that shouldn't require re-enrollment, as long as there's a match between the SSL listener cert installed and the FQDN that you're enrolling against and the devices expect to be communicating with. That shouldn't cause an issue. Moving down to the next question, where does the cloud connector sit? So this is a little bit of a customer-specific question. So, does it go in the DMZ? Does it go in the private network? Different customers approach this different ways. It does live on a Windows box, which most customers try to avoid deploying in their DMZ. So many customers choose to put it on their internal or trusted network and then connect it outbound either directly via 443 or via an unauthenticated proxy. So that's certainly one way to approach it. There are customers that choose to deploy it in the DMZ just because of their security preferences, so it's not a hard requirement by Citrix. It's just a matter of weighing the pros and cons against your security standards. Okay, next question. When using the cloud service, how quick is the response time when there are XenMobile server issues? Presently, we can reboot our server at will when needed. How long do we need to wait? So, Justin, is that something you want to speak to?
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of the XenMobile service in the cloud is, we offer a 99.9% SLA. And compared to an on-premise version to the cloud, there are a lot of server properties on-premise that do require a reboot after being changed. And we're at about 70–80% of our server properties no longer need a reboot in our cloud environments. So if you do make a change that you typically wouldn't on-premise, there's really no need for a reboot. We have 24/7, 365 monitoring from an infrastructure, performance, security, all within the actual our operations team on our cloud services. So what that means is basically before you in fact see a problem in your environment, we've already taken care of it on our end and already have a preemptive monitoring to make sure that you, the customer, your end users, your enrolled devices do not experience any type of issue. If in fact there is a setting that you feel needs to be changed, that needs a reboot, or if in fact you feel that the service needs a reboot for one reason or another, you can contact tech support, and tech support has access to reboot these. So all of our environments in the cloud, speaking of reboots and especially even upgrades and patching, all of our environments are always in the cluster, an active cluster. So when you do a reboot, when we do an upgrade or a patching, there is zero downtime for the environment. So even if you do a reboot, there doesn't need to be scheduled any type of maintenance window or downtime for that. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. So I think the last question is there a demo? That something else you want to cover off?
Yeah. So I can answer that. So for right now, the demo we do offer we offer 60 to 90 day XenMobile trials. For those of you that are interested in demoing it, I would definitely recommend you to reach out to your account manager, your partner, or your sales engineer that you're currently working with to get that started. We can offer those demos to show you how the service looks, as far as from a feature set, as of right now, how many other features, especially around the Windows 10 and UEM solution. From the previous question that we have in the cloud that we currently don't have right now in on-premise until our next on-premise release. Just get familiar with the cloud connector, the architecture, and even the Citrix Cloud control plane as well. So we can go that route, yes.
Great. Well, that is the last question that I see in the list. So if there are no others, Sarah, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you to wrap it up.
All right, great job, guys. Thanks, everyone, for your time this morning. If you have anything else, you can certainly drop it in the queue, and we can shoot you an email afterwards. Next month, actually on February 1st, our tips session will be covering Citrix on Azure. So that promises to be a great event with one of our cloud architects and also a co-presenter from the Microsoft team. So certainly check that out. Otherwise, thanks again for your time, and we hope everyone has a great day.